Hello, my name is Andrew Davis, and today I'm just going to talk a little bit about my discourse community, um, more specifically medical biology. Um, and to clarify, I'm a biology student. I study cellular and molecular biology, but I'm on a pre-med track. Um, so yeah, I'll talk about what medical biology is, what the goals are in medical biology. I'll analyze an artifact. We'll go through an analysis of an artifact. This is a research article done on COVID-19, and then we'll apply it, or what we know, to a real-world scenario, which is also going to be about COVID-19. So just to start, biology, study of life, very common subject in a lot of schools, and it's very broad. The way I like to think of it is as a tree, branches branching off, and off those branches are different specializations, right? So you can have botany, you can have genetics, you can have uh, environmentalism or ecology, and then one of those other branches is medical biology, which is more than likely exactly what you think. It's the treatment of patients, but it's also it includes, or the definition does, laboratory techniques, specifically immunology, bacteriology. Vaccines are a part of this field of biology, um, and so that's a specialization within the field of biology, and that is what I'm moving towards, and that is the discourse community I am a part of. As for the goals of this discourse community, across science, it's generally the same. This is a list of goals for biology students and staff at Truman University, but it can really be generalized out to anyone partaking in science. So for our needs, medical biology. And really, what's just being said here is that if you're a student, you need to be willing to grow, accept more information, be willing to learn, and appreciate what's being taught to you. And as for the staff, you need to be willing to teach the people who need to learn, the students. You need to have a balanced curriculum, and you need to make sure your knowledge is also staying up to date. You need to be knowledgeable, um, etc. And so, just in general terms, what they're saying here is that learners need to learn and teachers need to teach, um, which notably is a important concept in all discourse communities, right? In order for a community to keep held up, for the foundation to stay flat, you need those learners and teachers. Those learners will eventually become teachers to the new learners, right? So if you're a teacher, if you want to teach people, mentor them, give them your knowledge, and when you're done being a teacher, those learners that you had taught become the teachers for new learners. The cycle continues, community stays afloat. Um, Now, as for the artifact analysis, I dissected a article about COVID-19, and so in the first paragraph there, I just talked about what they had mentioned or discussed in the article. In the second paragraph, and this is important with a lot of articles, I had talked about how many authors there were, what their professions or degrees were in, how many sources were cited, and what journal this was posted in, which are all very important, especially in the field of science. In this case, it was a lot of MDs who had written this article on COVID-19, a couple PhDs, and a lot of sources were being cited. And on top of this was an article found in the New England Journal of Medicine, which is a very reliable and well-trusted journal where you can find a ton of articles related to medicine. In the top paragraph, I just talked about how articles are usually written, that is direct, third person, no pronouns, just get straight to the facts, straight to the data. You want to be as unopinionated and as unbiased as possible. And then following that, I talked about the audience. In this case, it was really aimed towards people who were in the medical field, so it was a bit harder to read, even especially for me, because of my lack of medical terminology. I had to look a lot of things up while I was reading it. Nevertheless, still very interesting. But audience in general is very important as well when reading through articles, and a lot of them will be aimed towards certain individuals from a certain profession. And on top of this, I talked a little bit about how skepticism is a very important mindset to have going in to reading these articles. You don't want to just read and then accept. You want to read and then question, right? How valid is this study? They had very few participants. What do I think the data means? I know the conclusion section said this, or the discussion section in the article had said this, but what do I think? So having that mindset as well when reading them is very important. Now, also regarding articles, I interviewed two people in my laboratory that I work through, or I work with, and both of these are second-year graduate students, fairly well versed in, or not fairly, very well versed in the field they work in. Mark, as seen on the left, talked about how specializations exist because of publications, right? Or we are able to specialize more specifically because of publications. If articles did not exist, we were not able to present those articles, and he had even mentioned things like symposiums, conferences, and meetings, then we'd be repeating the same studies over and over again. There was no intercommunication. We could not specialize. We'd have to stay very general, do it all together, which is very ineffective. And he even said disciplines overlap, never separate them. Kind of adding on to that point, we are able to connect and able to overlap because of these publications and articles and symposiums and meetings and conferences, because without them, we would gain no ground. Felicia, we mentioned how in the beginning of other projects, when you're starting a new project, you do research beforehand, and a lot of this research is done through articles. And these articles will, answer some of the questions you have, maybe shorten your hypothesis, but your question at hand, maybe enlarge it. Maybe you have more questions after you're doing research and looking through articles, and it also can provide relevant data, and it provides a lot when you're trying to start a new project. And so the more information you can gain through these articles, the better typically. And so that was her take on it. And so now we'll go into the application exercise. This is also about COVID-19. And we'll follow MedCram on this. MedCram they have a website, but mainly operate through their YouTube channel. Prior to the pandemic, they had been explaining medical lectures in detail for medical school students, but since the pandemic, have been a really good resource for me, and I know a lot of other people. If you're interested in COVID, I highly suggest looking through their videos. Super cool, not terribly long, super interesting. So, here we go. Doctors had a question, right? And that was, we knew there were respiratory implications of COVID-19, but what about cardiovascular? There was really no knowledge on it in the beginning. And if you're like me, I had just assumed it was a respiratory illness, which, as seen in the next study, was very wrong. Analyzation of the autopsies of COVID-19 patients were performed, and what they found were miniature blood clots in the lungs of those autopsies, and they were so abundant, it was statistically significant, and they had compared them to the autopsies of flu patients, and it was there were 7 times as many blood clots. I'm circling them right now. Those are the 2 of the 4 triangles that had pointed towards the blood clots. I can revert it a little bit. So right there, and there, right above the tips of those arrows are the blood clots. This is a very small image, so it does not do justice to how many blood clots were in their lungs. But there were a lot. And so knowing this information, they wanted to see how anticoagulation therapy would affect it, right? Because these therapies, it's blood thinners essentially. They either get rid of blood clots or prevent blood clots. So low-dose anticoagulation therapy prevents blood clots from occurring. High-dose gets rid of blood clots. And what they found, what they found, if I can get my mouse to work. Oh well, what they found in this study was that high-dose anticoagulation therapy did help severe COVID-19. but, there's a but, it was a very small study. And if you remember from earlier when I had mentioned the skepticism that's important when reading articles, this is that. You usually never want to trust a study just on its own with very few people in it, because it will not. Chances are it won't represent the whole population accurately. And so what they did is they made a bigger study. They had severe COVID-19 group, moderately severe COVID-19 group, and they tested anticoagulation therapies on them. Right? And what they had found, unfortunately, University of Manitoba, one of the bigger leaders in this study, what they found was that for severe COVID-19 patients, anticoagulation therapies were not working. Which in the previous study had said they were, but now they're not. Which again is why that skepticism was so important, because it obviously didn't represent the whole population. And so they actually had to stop enrollment for the severe COVID-19 group that they had going on. Because again, they did not improve. The American Society of Hematology has an FAQ board up regarding COVID-19. And doctors typically use this website, from at least what I've heard, to get recommendations as to how they should handle their patients. They had actually mentioned the study at University of Manitoba, had said how they were pausing enrollments for a lot of the patients, or not a lot of the patients, all of the patients in that group, because the anticoagulation therapy did not work. And so what they had concluded from this, as I'll highlight, is that until more data is available, doctors need to be very cautious when moving forward with anticoagulation therapy. And this study also kind of went into that, but this yielded better news. And so they had mentioned later on, all right, what they're mentioning here, I'm sorry, is that if anticoagulation therapy was given to moderately ill patients, it did work. It decreased the need for a longer hospitalization, need for life support, which is great to hear. But the severe COVID-19, unfortunately, still remained the same. And as I'll highlight here in a second, they had mentioned how it did not work at all, anticoagulation therapies, in critically ill COVID-19 patients and severe COVID-19 patients. They actually had said it was harmful in some patients, or may have been harmful in some patients. And so, throughout that whole process of jumping from study to study, you had seen that, or we had observed that, without that skepticism, none of this would have been found. Without this communication between doctors, none of this would have been found. Without these using those other studies as sources or mentioning them, none of this would have been found. And so intercommunication is so important in the field of science. And just to summarize what had happened, right? You had a question, or the doctors had a question. It was answered, and they had further questions coming from that question. Their first answer, they needed to be very skeptical about because of the lack of subjects they had. What they found was, because of that skepticism, they got to the right answer. Found that in severe COVID-19 patients, anticoagulation therapy does not work, may be harmful, which is unfortunate. It really is. But now that we know that, we can, doctors can handle that information as they will, and it will influence the way they treat certain patients, 110%. And so, thank you for listening. Here are the citations if you're interested in reading through any of the articles I had videos of, or as I'd mentioned earlier, or I apologize, as I mentioned earlier, or maybe I did not. But the artifact analysis, if you wanted to read through the full thing, the Google Docs link is there. And as I said, thank you for listening, and I hope you have a great night.